how do you determine how diverse your team needs to be? There was one thing I was reading up on the topic of algorithmic bias, which was on Compass, ProPublica's investigative report. And I was shocked that there was an inherent biasness against Black defendants, and it was determining whether someone was likely to be a reoffender. I mean, how do you break out of that loop?
Well, the first thing is identifying that the problem exists, which is what the journalists did in this case. Second issue is, where does the problem come from? And really, it's a nice example because computer science people have been looking at this challenge, and they've been looking at it from a sort of mathematical perspective. What is the best equation for defining fairness? And the problem is, it's not actually a mathematical problem, because there are many different ways in which you can look at fairness. And so in this particular case, actually the manufacturer of the algorithm in the Compass case was arguing that the system is unbiased because they were looking at accuracy. They were looking at how frequently does the algorithm get it right. And it gets it right for white defendants and for Black defendants at the same rate. But when it gets it wrong differently. For white defendants, it gets it wrong by judging them less likely to reoffend. And for Black defendant, when it gets it wrong by judging them more likely to reoffend. The kinds of errors that it generates, it is significantly biased, which is the dimension that the journalists looked at. But the problem is, because of the underlying statistics of actual people who were arrested, you cannot make the system unbiased across all dimensions at the same time. And so then it becomes actually a societal question. What do we think is the appropriate way of balancing this algorithm? Do we even think that using an algorithm in the justice system is appropriate? That's another part of the question. But if you're using an algorithm, what is the right definition of fairness? And that is something that needs to be done, especially if we're talking about something in the justice system, which is affecting society at large. This cannot be a decision made by just some company that is selling this system. It needs to be something that society is made aware of and can have a voice in the debate. That is where democratic process needs to come in. And so we need people with a lived experience within this kind of space to be able to flag up what the actual issues are. And that is actually especially the case when the issue is around, should we even be using an automated process? Or at least some of the transgender people that I've spoken to, they will, for instance, say, I don't actually care whether the algorithm is capable of going beyond the binary and saying not just assigning male or female, but being able to assign something in between. What I fundamentally disagree with is being assigned to something, and especially being assigned to something without being asked about it. It's back to the question of agency. Who actually has control over what is going on here? And so the other question is not just how can we make the algorithm work? Are we looking at this from the right perspective as to sort of the business model behind wanting to deploy an automated system? Is this a domain where optimizing the way in which things operate means making it economically more efficient? Or is this economical efficiency maybe not the best thing to do in all spaces? And that, for instance, is actually something we also see back again in things like social media. One of the elements that people have highlighted that would actually make social media better is to make it less efficient in how quickly you can share stuff. Make it so that you cannot just press the share button before you've read the article.
Or just the title button, not the content itself.
Yes.
I've noticed on social media platforms, there are moments where it is difficult to share certain articles or certain posts, but then the shareability element comes back again, and it seems as though they want people to come back on their platform and be using it all the time. So it seems like a tug of war that you never really win.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's part of social communication. I think a thing that one wins or loses, it's an ongoing process. And part of the thing is, how do we learn to communicate with other people through continuously engaging in that process? And as we're doing one thing for a while, we may feel like, I don't think this is the right thing to continue doing, and then we try something else. And people need to have that ability to do those kinds of changes. My own thinking actually was, and one of the reasons why I'm not much of a Facebook or something like that user, when we started with the internet, people were building their own web pages, and everybody could build their own web page completely differently. And you could just use hyperlinks to connect with each other. That's Tim Berners-Lee idea of a free internet, is use a hyperlink to connect to each other and everybody can connect how they want. Facebook streamlines this. It makes so you don't need to learn how to create a web page, and when you want to look for something, everybody's Facebook page looks the same. But it also means you don't have the freedom to create it in the way that you want, and you must present yourself in the way that Facebook has decided that you should present yourself. And that's true for all of the platforms. There's efficiency by having that templated way of doing things, but it also restricts your freedom of expression in a sense. And personally, I was more interested in building my own web page and doing things like that instead of going on to that kind of platform. But of course, if everybody has their own kind of page, it makes it more difficult to do the recommender systems. Knowing where to find what in order to do that might be more possible now with natural language processing having progressed a lot more. But then we get into still other questions about scraping people's data from outside of your platform. It's a thing that needs to be continuously developing. But in order to get it to properly develop, we need to make sure that it doesn't get locked in to a single organization, business. It could be a government one that has full control over this, and nobody else is able to actually move away from that. So that's where anti-competitive behavior becomes a big point, which is also what the big tech is currently being challenged on. And it'll be interesting to see how exactly that develops out, and how in the EU there's current work on the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. To what extent are those going to be focusing only on the very big firms, or is it going to start impacting also on the smaller ones? Getting that balance is tricky. How do we make sure that we regulate the use of artificial intelligence to make sure we don't get unintended negative consequences, but in a way that it doesn't kill the ability of smaller firms to be able to have that creativity to do things, which is why we need to be thinking we need to be thinking about how to make this solid regulation, but we also need to be thinking about how we can support. So how can innovation hubs support this? So for instance, if we're saying as part of the ethical development, you need to be engaging with the stakeholders who are going to be impacted by the kind of system, a large organization is probably more likely to be able to do that, to have a capacity to reach out to others. Can we use something like an innovation hub to be a place where stakeholder groups can have representatives, and then smaller organizations can go there to find these stakeholders to be able to engage with them in a more easy way? We need to think creatively, not just on the regulation, but also on how to support compliance with that regulation. And standards play a role in that as well, and continuing to work in that kind of space. But it's an interesting, continuing, developing process.
How effective do you think the current regulation is? I mean, you have obviously the GDPR, but what else can the government do?
Well, I mean, is GDPR effective? I think it has had a huge effect. It hasn't worked perfectly. To a large extent, that's because of insufficient funding support to the regulators that need to be doing the work. It's taken the legal community some time to understand the regulation as well, including judges. They haven't really understood it yet, some of them. But personal data protection is only one part of the puzzle. And like we talked about, the network effects and the way in which market competition doesn't really work in that space. Therefore, needing things like the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Service Act, and equivalents in other regions is coming forward, and that needs to push in. So that doesn't currently exist yet, and we see the problem. It's basically impossible for anybody to compete with Amazon at the moment because of the market effects. When it comes to the use of AI, at the moment, there is no regulations that are specific to that. There's a proposed regulation, which is still going to take probably 2 years until it's finalized. But that's not going to be the final one, because this is a high-level horizontal legislation that's looking at, is your system posing high risk or not high risk to safety, security, and fundamental rights? And the majority of systems will not be considered to be high risk. But that doesn't mean that there isn't something about those systems potentially needs to be regulated. It's just that they're not posing a direct risk to human safety. And so there's going to need to be sector-specific updates to existing regulation. And often it's not going to be a case that you want to say we need a new AI regulation, but rather we just need to make sure that existing protections are sufficiently applied as AI is enabling new business models. So a nice example of that, I think, is things like employees' rights when it comes to being monitored, being micromanaged. And these problems are arising because they're being facilitated by AI, but it's not actually an AI problem as such. It's a business model problem. It's just that the AI has facilitated that kind of business model. If we're talking about the kinds of protections that people need to get, it needs to be part of the rights of the worker to be free, to not be continuously monitored, to be able to arrange their workspace or the way of working in a way that suits them. Because ultimately, it doesn't really matter the way in which they're being micromanaged is being done by an algorithm or by a human. It's the fact that they're being micromanaged that's the problem. And that is still sometimes one of the issues with getting this regulatory space right, is clarifying. Is it the technology that we actually need to be regulating, or is it something else? Is it more the way in which organizations treat people that needs to be regulated? Because if you were to regulate it on the basis of technology, you could easily go to the next new technology that comes along and do the same kind of business decision that would have negative consequences. But because the regulation is based on technology, it wouldn't apply. So you want to be identifying correctly what is the actual problem, which is again similar to that earlier thing that we discussed with some of the ethics issues with the use of AI. Is it something that can be where the solution lies in fixing the technology, or is the solution actually to step back and say, this is an area where we shouldn't be using technology, where having a human interaction is actually fundamental to making this the right. Maybe it's not that it needs to be a human interaction, but any use of machine learning in the justice system, I think needs to be considered from, is this actually compatible with the fundamentals of how we say the justice system should work? Because machine learning fundamentally is statistics. It's looking at statistical patterns. But fundamental of our legal system is that we say every case needs to be treated as an individual. Every individual defendant's case needs to be handled at the individual level. These two things, are they compatible? Can they be made compatible? Or is it a case that we need to say, actually, machine learning is fundamentally different from the core principle of how we want to do justice. Therefore, it shouldn't be used in that kind of space. We need to be looking for different tools to support how we run the justice system. These kinds of questions need to be asked. And that's where it's important to have not just technical people around the table discussing this, because it isn't necessarily a technical issue that you're actually trying to solve. It may actually be more of a societal kind of question.
In some recent news on Facebook, they removed the facial recognition. And I thought it was very interesting that Facebook's VP of AI, Pesenti, actually said that it's because regulators are still trying to play catch up and the regulation is not in place. Therefore, they are removing it, even though there is a need for that tag.
I mean, it was definitely interesting to see that they're removing it with the argument of privacy, that they stand for privacy and that's why they're going to remove it. If that was, then why didn't they think about that when they introduced it to begin with? Because Facebook's attitude towards privacy has dramatically changed. And clearly it hasn't changed purely due to self-reflection of it. It has to do with public pressure. Yeah, I mean, they're removing the labeling of the automatic labeling of the faces. I think in a way, part of the whole having agency over things, I think it's a good move. I think it's a little bit problematic that faces or images that have previously been automatically labeled continue to exist, and they're not removing the labels from those, which means I don't know how many pictures are out there with my name on them. I don't know. And those images are going to be potentially available for other ethically dubious companies like Clearview to be scraping to create their databases where I will show up as a labeled face, even though I've never consented to it. And those systems, Clearview is selling it to law enforcement in various countries, who knows where. It's interesting to see how it made this be one of the first new statements that they come out with under the new branding of their company. I think it signals an attempt to we're rebranding and we're trying to position ourselves as being different from that previous brand that is currently having so much PR trouble. Please do trust us. We have so much better ways of approaching the questions now. I have my doubts that a lot of people are going to buy into this. I think the number of problems that they've got at the moment is so big that a simple rebranding and one statement here isn't going to make much of a difference. And the whole concept of this metaverse, I tend to agree with the various publications that are pointing to this as additional surveillance society on steroids, kind of how to get people to spend more time in a place where they can be monitored from all dimensions.
It makes me think of 2018, the Cambridge Analytica, and there was that whole delete Facebook movement. But the thing is that what was the actual impact that everyone was saying delete Facebook, but Facebook is still being heavily used. Accounts are not deleted. So this could be another delete Facebook movement. And even though agency is an issue, it's clearly not that big of an issue.
Well, the problem that we had then, and to a certain extent still have, is to say delete Facebook doesn't work because people are like, yeah, but I still want to be able to communicate with my family who live on a different continent, but they all use Facebook. So, and what do you want me to do? Switch to Instagram, which is also owned by Facebook, or use WhatsApp, which is owned by Facebook? There was the attempt to start a social media platform that would be decentralized, diaspora. Conceptually, it was a great idea and I looked into it, but their big problem was exactly how do you start up a new social media platform that nobody's on yet? And then with the decentralized model, it made it even a bit more difficult for how to find people who wanted to join it. It's how do you get the momentum going to build a new social media platform? So yeah, delete Facebook, but we need to have somewhere else to go. If that's not the solution, I think the solution needs to be, it's not all up to the individual. Social media has become a utility. It has become a service like the phone company. And that means there needs to be certain rules that apply to it. And there's an obligation by the state to serve its citizens by making sure that these utilities operate in the right kind of way. And I think that is where the difference lies now relative to the Cambridge Analytica time. And I don't think it's necessarily because the evidence is stronger. It is to a certain extent because now it is direct Facebook, and whereas the other thing was Cambridge Analytica, which had used Facebook, that was having the data coming out. But I think the more important thing is it builds on the experience from the Cambridge Analytica issues didn't go away. It may not have led us to a tipping point of really causing those changes in legislation or in pressuring the way in which Facebook operates or social media platforms operate through the shareholder groups or something like that. But it did happen and everybody's still aware of that. And now this new thing comes and goes on top of that. And it does add up, same as the data points that we've been feeding into the social media platforms add up over time and create a bigger whole. So in the same way, these different events, including the smaller events that happened in between, they all add up to create a bigger whole of showing that these platforms and Facebook especially, they're not being managed in the way that they need to be managed, and there needs to be external oversight and control over how they're being managed. I think one of the problems with Facebook and some of the other big tech companies in the US is also to do with the level of control that an individual CEO has through things like the way in which shares are being given out, the fact that they have a type of shares that doesn't give you any voting powers. Most shareholders in Facebook have no voting powers over what Facebook does. Unless Mark Zuckerberg decides to do something, there's nobody that can push him to do it. It's the typical problem of the autocrat. They may start off with a certain thing where you think it's a benevolent autocrat, but you have no guarantees that that will stay. And they will be increasingly difficult to receive criticism and more likely to deviate from understanding the world that they're interacting with. So that's a core challenge.
I expect most of us listening will not ever be autocrats, but just users. So I wonder, just from two different perspectives, like going back to that Unbiased project, one of the things that came out of it was the fact that the words that were used by the children were the words like disempowered or sharenting, which I thought were very, very strong, powerful words. And I just wonder, how do we regulate or assist young people who are using social media? How do we think about that?
Well, one thing is recognizing that young people have certain vulnerabilities and certain rights that are recognized under the UN Charter of the Rights of Children. By the way, everybody up to the age of 18 is a child, not 30. And that means limiting certain kinds of things that are the ways in which data about children is being used. The UK's Act on the Rights of Children, the age-appropriate design, goes quite a long way in this. So you cannot do targeted advertising at children. You cannot collect data about children for the purposes of advertising or for any purposes other than the direct delivery of the service. It also limits the way in which you design the platform, so the dark patterns that make it addictive. It means you need to be able to communicate what you're doing on the platform with their data in a way that a child will be able to understand. And it recognizes that not all children are the same, as a 5-year-old and a 15-year-old have different interests, have different levels of being able to understand, have different things that they consider to be beneficial or negative for them. And that should also be taken into account. It is still at an early phase. It only came into force recently, so we haven't really tested yet to what extent it works. Will the ICO be able to enforce it? Will the ICO have the manpower to do it, the funding? But there is definitely a lot of interest outside of the UK in this piece of legislation and in taking it on board in either directly or a variant of that. Quite a number of countries, including also the state of California, the EU, countries outside of Europe and the US as well. That's one strong thing. But the other thing is also thinking about how we actually need to be creating an online space where a child can play and creatively engage with things. So this is something that a new project that the Five Rights Foundation is doing in their Digital Future Commission, which is a safe place to play online, to be. And one of the challenges is how can we make it so that you can really be creative? At the core is, if I'm playing with a pencil and a pen and pencil, I can easily draw outside of the lines. I can go wherever I want. If I'm engaging with a digital tool, it is much more difficult to do something with it that is different from what the designer had originally intended to do, because it'll just give an error. It simply won't cooperate with me in doing that kind of thing. So how can we create online spaces that are maximally flexible for a child to be able to express themselves in a way so that we can actually continue to have good development of our ways of understanding the world, of our ways of shaping our minds and not being confined by the rules that are being dictated. It comes into the question, if children are spending so much more time in the digital world, is that imposing a way of thinking onto you that says, I must always follow a certain kind of strict rules? These are sort of how are the ways in which we are actually engaging with people at a young age shaping their attitude towards things, and which is one of the areas why, for instance, I have a lot of concerns regarding the use of biometrics in schools, face recognition to pay for their lunch. Maybe it is easier, but it also instills a sense that having face recognition around is a normal thing. Normalizing an attitude around surveillance. Is that something that we want to be doing with children? I don't think so. So we need to be thinking bigger as to not just, am I making this particular action more efficient, but what are the consequences of that on society? And that's really at the core of what I think most of the problems that we've seen with the introduction of these technologies, including Facebook. Facebook was introduced as, I want to be able to connect between people and share some messages without thinking through what the possible consequences are. And it's the lack of thinking through of the consequences. That's really where the challenge is. That's also where a lot of, if we look at things like the standard for algorithmic bias considerations that we're developing in IEEE, or other standards that are ethics related, or other debates around ethics of the AI, really at the core of a lot of this is, are you aware of what you're doing, and have you thought about the broader consequences of it? Have you thought about who it is that's actually engaging with it, and that maybe they're not all the same as you are? Have you thought about the fact that even if you have one intention for how the system should be used, it is most likely going to be used for many different things as well. We need to be starting to think more long-term, big picture around our things. That means thinking outside our particular discipline, outside of our particular intention, to actually we're putting this out into a world where it's going to interact with stuff.
YouTube for kids, it's done really, really well. It's really incorporated into the education system. You don't hear that kind of controversy. So they must have thought these things through and they've covered the challenges that you normally face. But then you have things like Instagram, where they wanted to create a kids version of it. And there was a tremendous controversy, which seems strange to me since you do want to create a platform that is safe for young people.
I think the Instagram for kids is particularly raised the controversy because Instagram has this addictiveness, keep pulling you back to using the platform as a core part of it, and a oversharing. It stimulates you to overshare what's going on. The core business model of Instagram is the thing that is problematic. How can you make a version of that for children that isn't going to take those problems along with it? Is a big question mark. And I don't really know what the intent is of an Instagram for children if it isn't to continue to do that kind of thing.
Well, thank you so much, Ansgar. I normally love to wrap up all my interviews with these questions. So the first one is this. Do you feel like doing all this work that you're doing, you have found your why?
Yes, I do. I'm definitely happy with working in this space, and I have a sense that I am contributing something useful that is helping to make the world a better place, I would hope.
What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind?
Well, I hope that my legacy is that I contributed to thinking about the way in which we use technology in a more holistic way as to how it impacts on society, and that we actually are thinking about creating a better society as opposed to just maximizing profits.
What do you think are the most important qualities of a successful person?
I think one of the most important qualities is that you are actually thinking, is what I'm doing useful to the wider world? And therefore being willing to share it and not to feel like I need to control it all the time. If I give this thought or this information outward, it will be taken by somebody else and therefore I will have lost something. I think generally being willing to share the ideas, it will come back to you afterwards anyway. And you should trust yourself that you have so many ideas that you're not going to lose out just because one idea maybe gets picked up by someone else.
And where can people go to connect with you, find out what you're doing?
I think probably the best place is to go to my LinkedIn profile, and do feel free to message me and reach out on that. And I'm happy to start communications from there and then take it offline to other spaces.